Grace remembered a time when the town of Oak Ridge, Vermont felt large and full of possibilities, back when her father still looked her in the eye. She spent her early childhood walking through the northern apple orchards with him holding his hand, while he promised that they would always be a team after her mother passed away. Those early years were quiet and safe, defined by the simple warmth of a parent who listened to her stories and cleared the snow from her boots every winter morning. But promises made in the shadow of deep sorrow often slip away when convenience takes over, and the warmth vanished the day Eleanor entered their lives. Eleanor brought a sharp measuring gaze into the household, a gaze that instantly decided Grace was an inconvenience that needed to be managed rather than a child who needed to be loved. When her half-sister Lily was born a few years later, the subtle shifting of affection became a permanent wall, leaving Grace to navigate the cold corners of her own home while her father learned the habit of looking down at the floor whenever she entered the room. The transformation from daughter to outsider happened in small, silent steps that Grace could never quite find the words to fight against. While Lily received new dresses made of fine blue cloth for the summer festivals, Eleanor always told Grace that her old green gown could be altered or mended to last through another season. Lily took music lessons from an instructor who traveled from the city, while Grace spent her afternoons in the kitchen helping the cook track the grocery bills and clean the heavy cast-iron pans. Whenever local families came to visit their home in Oak Ridge, Eleanor proudly introduced Lily to the guests, praising her quick wit and bright smile, while Grace stood near the hallway door holding heavy trays of tea and warm pastries. One afternoon, a visiting woman looked at Grace and asked if she was the new maid, prompting Eleanor to laugh softly and say that she was just a distant relative who helped around the house. Grace looked toward her father, waiting for him to correct the lie, but Thomas merely adjusted his glasses and took another slow sip of his tea without saying a word. By the time Grace reached her 22nd year, she had grown accustomed to the silence and the weight of the tasks piled onto her shoulders. She learned to find solace in the early mornings when the house was quiet, finding a strange kind of peace in the physical work that everyone else disdained. Then a wealthy young businessman named Charles arrived in Oak Ridge, driving a polished carriage that drew the attention of every family on their street. He carried letters of introduction from family friends and explicitly asked to speak with Grace after hearing about her quiet demeanor and skill in managing the household affairs. For 3 days, a small spark of hope flared in her chest as Charles spoke to her with genuine politeness in the front parlor, asking about her favorite books and her thoughts on the countryside. But Eleanor quickly noticed the attention Charles paid to Grace, and by the 4th afternoon, the conversation in the parlor was systematically redirected toward Lily. Lily was summoned with her bright dresses and loud laughter, and within a week, Charles stopped looking at Grace entirely, his attention completely captured by the bright show Eleanor had staged for him. The announcement of the engagement came swiftly, followed by 2 weeks of frantic wedding preparations that kept Grace working from sunrise until late into the night. She washed the linen sheets, polished the silverware, and arranged the white flowers until her fingers were raw and trembling with exhaustion. On the morning of the ceremony, the local church was filled with townspeople all dressed in their finest clothes to witness Lily marry the wealthiest eligible man in the district. Grace stood near the back of the altar, her breath catching as she watched Charles slip a golden ring onto Lily's finger while the crowd offered their loud approval. Lily turned her head slightly, catching Grace's eye across the stone steps, and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed under the high wooden beams of the ceiling. She stepped closer to Grace, holding up her hand, so the gold caught the light from the tall windows, and whispered that nobody should ever expect a real gentleman to choose a girl who spent her days scrubbed in kitchen soot. Eleanor stepped forward to join her daughter, a cold smile lifting the corners of her mouth as she looked at Grace's faded gray dress. She told Grace that she should thank her for finding a solution to her future, because a girl with no prospects could not remain a burden on her father's house forever. Before Grace could process the words, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open, and a quiet man stepped inside the building. His boots were covered in light dust. His gray coat was plain and worn at the elbows, and he held a simple woolen cap loosely in his pale hands. His most striking features were his snow-white hair and remarkably pale skin, which seemed to catch the morning light in a way that made him look completely detached from the rural town. Eleanor laughed aloud, gesturing toward the newcomer, and announced to the entire congregation that she had successfully found a husband for Grace as well. The church erupted into open amusement, with several local merchants shaking their heads and laughing at the sight of the quiet handyman standing by the door. Lily walked a slow circle around the white-haired man, inspecting him as if he were a piece of damaged furniture, before looking back at her sister with a triumphant expression. She remarked that the match was absolutely perfect, as a simple laborer was exactly what Grace deserved, and now the family would no longer have to feel embarrassed by her presence. Grace felt the gaze of every person in the town pressing against her, watching for her tears, waiting for her to break down or beg her father for help. She looked at Eleanor's pleased face, then at Lily's mocking eyes, and finally at her father, who kept his gaze fixed firmly on his own shoes. In that single moment, the fragile string of hope she had held onto for years finally snapped, replaced by a cold, clear clarity that washed away her fear. She walked past her sister, her steps steady and deliberate, and stood directly in front of the quiet man with the white hair. The handyman looked down at her, his pale gray eyes steady and surprisingly calm, despite the loud laughter echoing through the stone church. Grace looked into his face, seeing a strange, quiet strength beneath his simple clothes that made the opinions of the crowd seem entirely unimportant. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the sudden hush of the building, stating that she would rather spend her life with an honest working man than spend another day with people who treated her as if she had no worth. Eleanor's smile vanished instantly, Lily's jaw dropped in disbelief, and Thomas grew visibly pale as Grace extended her hand toward the white-haired stranger. The man's hand was cool to the touch, but his grip was firm and reassuring as he closed his fingers around hers. Without looking back at the family she had known, Grace turned her back on the altar and walked out of the church into the bright morning air, leaving the stunned townspeople in absolute silence. The sound of the townspeople's fading amusement seemed to linger in the air long after the church disappeared behind the rows of pine trees. Grace sat quietly on the wooden bench of a small horse-drawn wagon, watching the dirt road unfold before them as the horse maintained a steady, slow pace toward the northern woods. Jasper, the white-haired man she had just married, held the leather reins with relaxed movements, his pale face calm as he watched the path ahead. Neither of them spoke for the first 3 miles of the journey, allowing the natural sounds of the forest and the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves to fill the space between them. Grace expected to feel a sudden wave of panic or regret over her impulsive choice, but instead, a deep sense of physical relief settled over her shoulders. For the first time in 12 years, nobody was telling her to move out of the way, and nobody was criticizing the color of her hair or the plainness of her clothes. When the wagon finally slowed down, they were standing in front of a small stone cottage nestled against the edge of a thick, quiet forest, where the trees grew tall and dense. The house was modest, with green ivy climbing up the gray stone walls and small boxes of yellow flowers sitting beneath the glass windows. A clear, shallow stream bubbled over smooth rocks near the wooden front porch, and a few white chickens wandered across the grass, pecking at the dirt. Jasper hopped down from the seat with light, effortless movements that seemed surprisingly graceful for a man who worked with his hands and offered his arm to help her down. He looked at her with a quiet, tentative expression, noting that the place was not grand like her father's house, and hoping it would be enough for her. Grace looked at the small garden patch and the sturdy wooden door smiling as she told him that it was more than enough to make her happy. The interior of the cottage was exceptionally clean and smelled faintly of dried lavender pine wood and fresh baking bread. A heavy oak table stood in the center of the kitchen, already set with simple ceramic plates, and a large bowl of steaming vegetable soup alongside roasted potatoes and warm rolls. Waiting by the hearth were two older townspeople, Arthur and Martha, who Jasper introduced as his longtime family caretakers and companions. Grace braced herself for the cold looks and sharp questions she had always received from adults, but Martha immediately rushed forward and wrapped her in a warm, genuine hug. Martha expressed her pure delight at Grace's arrival, while Arthur nodded with a kind smile, stating that Jasper had spoken very highly of her quiet strength. The meal that followed felt entirely strange to Grace, simply because every person at the table seemed to genuinely want her there, listening carefully whenever she spoke, and passing her the best portions of the food before serving themselves. As the weeks turned into a regular routine, Grace found herself adjusting easily to the daily demands of maintaining the small household. She helped Martha wash the clothes, tended to the small vegetable garden behind the cottage, and prepared the evening meals before Jasper returned from his daily work. Jasper worked long hours, often leaving before the sun was fully up, and returning after the stars had appeared in the night sky. Despite his long days of physical labor, his clothes never seemed as dirty as the other handymen in town, and his pale skin never tanned under the summer sun. Grace began to notice small details that did not quite align with the life of a simple countryside laborer, such as the way he spoke with the precise, clear vocabulary of a scholar rather than a town worker. He possessed an impressive collection of old leather-bound books, written in languages she did not recognize, and he read them easily by the light of a single candle while the rest of the house slept. One evening during supper, Arthur casually brought up a complicated legal dispute that was currently being debated by the state politicians in the capital city. To Grace's surprise, Jasper offered a concise, intelligent analysis of the situation, explaining the economic consequences with the confidence of a man who understood power intimately. The depth of his knowledge was startling for a local handyman, but when Grace asked where he had learned about such matters, Jasper simply smiled and said he picked up information from the newspapers during his supply trips. Another afternoon, a prominent merchant from the town center arrived at the cottage to settle a boundary disagreement regarding the timber woods near the property line. The wealthy merchant, who usually treated the town workers with open arrogance, listened to Jasper's quiet advice with total concentration, nodding quickly and agreeing to the terms without a single argument. Grace watched the interaction from the kitchen window, wondering why a wealthy business owner would show such intense deference to a man who wore a plain gray coat. The mysteries continued to accumulate whenever they traveled into the outer edges of the town to purchase winter supplies or grain for the horse. A local magistrate, known for his stern demeanor and high social standing, stopped his carriage when he saw Jasper walking along the sidewalk. The older man stepped down onto the dirt road, removed his hat first, and addressed Jasper with a level of formal respect that was usually reserved for high-ranking officials. Later that same day, a wealthy landowner from the valley side of Oakridge passed them on the trail and bowed his head deeply toward Jasper before continuing on his way. When Grace questioned Jasper about these strange encounters during the wagon ride home, he laughed softly and told her that people in small towns simply liked to be polite to those who worked hard. She accepted his explanation for the time being. But the image of the wealthy magistrate bowing to her white-haired husband remained fixed in her thoughts as they drove into the quiet forest. While Grace was building her quiet life at the edge of the woods, Lily was finding that her own marriage was significantly less perfect than she had imagined. In public, Charles remained charming and attentive, buying her expensive gifts and walking beside her during the Sunday town socials to maintain their high standing. But behind the closed doors of their large brick home, his demeanor changed into something cold, dismissive, and increasingly impatient with her constant demands. He spent his evenings locked in his private study, reviewing financial ledgers, refusing to join her for dinner or listen to her accounts of the local gossip. When Lily complained about his lack of attention, he simply told her that her constant talking was giving him a headache and ordered her to leave the room. Several times over the course of the month, he failed to accompany her to important dinner parties, forcing her to arrive alone and endure the subtle whispers of the other wealthy women. The growing distance in her own home only served to fuel Lily's intense obsession with what was happening to her sister in the forest cottage. She had fully expected Grace to return to their father's house within 3 weeks, weeping and begging Eleanor for a servant's position after discovering the hardships of poverty. Instead, the local peddlers who traveled through the northern woods brought back reports that Grace looked remarkably content, healthy, and genuinely happy with her choice. The news deeply offended Lily's sense of superiority, as she could not tolerate the idea that the sister she had spent years looking down upon was thriving while she sat alone in a cold house. Lily became determined to engineer an opportunity that would force Grace to face the reality of her low social standing and shatter her apparent peace. She decided to host a massive autumn gathering at her husband's grand estate, inviting every influential family from 3 neighboring towns to ensure the crowd was as large as possible. To everyone's surprise, an expensive white invitation was delivered to the small stone cottage, explicitly requesting the presence of Grace and her new husband. Jasper handed the letter to Grace across the kitchen table, offering to let her stay home if she felt the event would cause her any discomfort or distress. Grace looked at the formal handwriting, shook her head, and stated that if she hid every time her sister wished to mock her, the cruelty would never truly stop. When the evening of the party arrived, Grace wore her cleanest gray dress, while Jasper wore his plain coat, though he had brushed the fabric until it looked neat and presentable. As they walked into the bright, crowded ballroom of Lily's house, the loud conversations around the long tables suddenly paused, and dozens of eyes turned to inspect their simple clothing. Several wealthy women openly stared through their silver glasses, whispering behind their fans about the sheer audacity of bringing a common handyman into a high society event. Lily spent the first 2 hours of the evening directing the conversation toward topics of immense wealth, luxury travel, and the high cost of her imported jewelry. Every comment she made was designed to carry a sharp barb aimed directly at Grace, who sat quietly at the end of the long table eating her food. Lily described the beautiful silk carpets she intended to order from Europe, then turned to ask Jasper if the winter mud in the forest made it difficult to keep his boots clean. Jasper simply smiled politely, stating that a little honest dirt never did any harm to a sturdy pair of work boots, a response that caused a few older gentlemen to nod in quiet approval. The lack of anger from both Grace and Jasper frustrated Lily immensely, causing her to speak louder and demand more attention from the guests around her. As the evening progressed, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Vance, who had recently retired from a high government position in the capital, was introduced to their table. The moment he heard Jasper's last name, his entire expression shifted from casual politeness to intense, startled surprise. He opened his mouth as if to say something formal, but Jasper gave him a quick, steady look that made the older man immediately close his jaw and swallow his words. "Mr." Vance quickly recovered his composure and began discussing the local weather, but Grace noticed that he remained standing for the rest of the evening whenever Jasper was speaking. Later on, another wealthy guest accidentally caught sight of a unique silver ring Jasper wore on his right hand, a ring featuring a detailed crest of a crown surrounded by night-blooming lilies. The man stared at the silver band for several long seconds, his face turning slightly pale before he quietly excused himself from the conversation and moved to the opposite side of the room. The wagon ride back to the cottage was quiet, with the midnight moon casting long, pale shadows across the dirt road through the branches of the tall pine trees. Grace looked at Jasper's profile, noting how his white hair seemed to glow softly in the moonlight, and how his pale skin never seemed to feel the winter chill. She asked him directly why important men like Mr. Vance looked so startled when they heard his name, and why people seemed afraid of the silver ring on his finger. Jasper reached over and gently took her hand, his cool fingers wrapping around hers as he told her that old men often imagined grand mysteries where only simple things existed. His voice was calm and smooth, completely free of any tension, but Grace could feel the weight of the unanswered questions settling deeper into her mind as the horse turned onto the dark forest path. As the autumn frost melted into the early warmth of a Vermont spring life, inside the forest cottage settled into a deeply satisfying rhythm of mutual support. Every evening when Jasper returned from his duties, no matter how exhausted his frame appeared, he always greeted Grace with a genuine smile and asked about her day before mentioning his own. He never complained about the cost of supplies or the price of grain, but Grace frequently caught him repairing his old iron tools instead of buying new ones at the town forge. She watched him carefully measure the wood pile to ensure they had enough fuel for the colder nights, refusing to spend their small savings on things he claimed he could easily build himself. The constant physical sacrifices he made for her comfort troubled her because she knew he was carrying the entire financial burden of the household on his own shoulders. One evening, while they were sitting near the warm fireplace, Grace watched Jasper use a thick needle to mend a torn leather horse harness by the dim light of a single wax candle. She told him that he was working far too hard and that he should not have to manage the responsibilities of their lives completely alone. Jasper looked up from his work, his white hair falling across his forehead, and told her that he was doing perfectly fine, because seeing her safe was all the reward he required. Grace shook her head, stating that they were only doing fine because he was taking all the strain, and she reminded him that she spent years managing her father's large estate. She knew how to organize accounts, manage workers, track food supplies, and handle complicated household logistics that most wealthy ladies never bothered to learn. Jasper resisted the idea for 3 days, but Grace remained completely determined to contribute until he finally relented and agreed to find her a position. The decision created a significant internal problem for Jasper, because the only place that truly required a skilled manager was the grand historic estate that sat hidden deep within the northern forest. The vast property belonged entirely to his own family, a massive truth that he had spent months actively hiding from her out of fear of changing their simple life. When he brought up the plan to Arthur and Martha in the kitchen, neither of his companions reacted with any favor or enthusiasm toward his continued secrecy. Martha set her teacup down with a loud click, stating that the situation had gone on long enough and that Grace had already proven the true quality of her heart. Arthur nodded in agreement, adding that Grace had willingly married him when she believed he possessed absolutely nothing, leaving wealth behind for the sake of peace. Jasper remained silent, knowing they were right, but the fear of losing the genuine, simple love they had built kept him from finding the courage to speak. A few days later, Jasper drove the wagon through a set of massive stone gates located 6 miles outside the main town center, entering a property that took Grace's breath away. The estate was far larger than her father's lands, featuring elegant gray stone buildings that overlooked miles of perfectly manicured lawns and bright flower gardens. Long gravel paths wound through old-growth forests, and rows of white flowering shrubs bordered the stone walkways that led toward the grand main house. Grace stared through the window of the wagon, remarking that the property must belong to an incredibly powerful and important family, while Jasper merely nodded and said the owners were respectable people. When they arrived at the rear entrance, several senior staff members were waiting to greet them, and the estate manager grew visibly startled the moment his eyes landed on Grace's face. He looked from Jasper to Grace, and back again, his eyes widening before he quickly bowed deeply, offering a level of formal respect that was far above what an employee expected. Throughout her first full week of managing the estate's interior supplies, Grace encountered the same strange, overly polite behavior from every single worker on the property. A young maid rushed to carry a small box of linens before Grace could even lift it, and a footman nearly dropped his silver tray when she walked into the dining hall. The workers spoke to her with quiet, gentle voices, always stepping aside in the corridors and bowing their heads whenever she walked past their workstations. When Grace told the elderly head housekeeper that there was absolutely no need to fuss over her lunch or bring her extra tea, the older woman's eyes grew soft with emotion. The housekeeper murmured that if Grace only knew the truth, she would understand why everyone was so anxious to ensure her complete comfort and safety. Grace did not understand the strange comment, but she quickly dismissed it, focusing all her energy on tracking the food expenses and earning the wages she wanted to bring home to Jasper. The quiet routine at the grand estate was completely disrupted 3 weeks later when a wealthy young woman named Victoria arrived to spend the season at the property. Victoria was beautiful in a highly polished, deliberate way, wearing expensive silk gowns and carrying herself with the absolute confidence of someone who expected the world to bow to her. According to the quiet whispers among the kitchen maids, Victoria had spent the last year positioning herself as the perfect future bride for the estate's mysterious, unseen owner. She spoke about the historic property with immense familiarity, giving loud opinions on how the rooms should be redecorated and how the gardens should be altered in the coming year. Her first interaction with Grace appeared completely pleasant, with Victoria offering a bright smile, but the warmth vanished the moment she noticed how the staff treated Grace. Victoria watched with growing irritation as the estate manager personally thanked Grace for her work, and saw the kitchen staff preparing special baskets of fresh fruit for her to take home. Within 4 days, the subtle hostility began to manifest, as Grace found her daily supply logs mysteriously misplaced or altered to create confusing errors. Instructions regarding the dinner preparations were deliberately withheld from her, causing minor delays that Victoria quickly pointed out to the other supervisors during the afternoon meetings. Grace realized what was happening, but she refused to respond with anger, simply working twice as hard to correct the mistakes and maintain her quiet dignity. One morning, while arranging blankets in the upper guest wing, she overheard Victoria speaking sharply to her personal maid in the adjoining corridor. Victoria stated that she did not care who the plain, gray-dressed girl was, but she could not tolerate the way the entire household seemed to protect her. The situation grew significantly more dangerous when news of Grace's new position finally reached the ears of Lily back in the town center. The knowledge that her sister was working at the most prominent estate in the region immediately captured her attention and fueled her deep-seated jealousy. Lily arranged a formal visit to Victoria's quarters, and the two women quickly discovered a shared hatred for Grace's quiet, unbothered demeanor. Lily filled Victoria's ears with exaggerated stories from their childhood, painting Grace as an incredibly ambitious, manipulative girl who used a fake innocence to gain favors from wealthy people. Victoria listened to the rumors with intense satisfaction, and within 48 hours, the false stories began to filter down through the drawing rooms and the local society gatherings. People began to whisper that Grace was attempting to improve her social standing through deception, using her position as a manager to catch the eye of the wealthy families who visited the estate. Meanwhile, back at the small stone cottage, Martha and Arthur were reaching the absolute limit of their patience regarding Jasper's continued silence. After hearing a report from one of the estate footmen about the false rumors Victoria was spreading, Martha confronted Jasper while he was washing his hands at the kitchen sink. She told him that his wife was working herself to exhaustion on her own family's lands, while total strangers were allowed to stain her good name. Arthur nodded from the table, adding that every single day he delayed the truth, he was making the eventual revelation harder for Grace to forgive. Jasper remained standing by the sink, his pale face tight, with an internal struggle that he could no longer easily hide from his caretakers. He admitted that the fear of losing the simple, honest marriage they had built was the only thing keeping him from revealing his true identity as the owner of the lands. The carefully constructed campaign of whispers and rumors finally reached its boiling point during a massive afternoon garden reception hosted on the estate grounds. Hundreds of influential guests wandered through the flower gardens, enjoying the white wine and music while servants moved between the tables with heavy silver trays of food. Grace had spent the entire morning helping the kitchen staff prepare the outdoor pavilions, hoping to disappear back to the cottage before the main guests arrived. Unfortunately, Victoria spotted her near the rose gardens and deliberately called out her name, drawing the immediate attention of a large group of wealthy townspeople. Surrounded by the crowd, Victoria began asking sharp, mocking questions about Grace's presence at the estate, her tone dripping with a fake concern that fooled nobody. Lily stepped forward from the crowd to join Victoria, a triumphant smile spreading across her face as she repeated the false stories she had spent weeks perfecting. She announced to the gathering that Grace was simply an ambitious girl who had married a common handyman after being cast out by her own father for her difficult nature. The townspeople began to whisper among themselves, looking at Grace with cold, judgmental eyes that made her feel as though she were standing back in the church on Lily's wedding day. Grace stood entirely frozen against the stone wall, her hands trembling as the familiar weight of public humiliation pressed down against her chest. Before Lily could finish her next sentence, the crowd parted, and Jasper walked into the center of the garden path, his steps completely silent, but his presence instantly shifting the air in the yard. Victoria attempted to dismiss him with a wave of her gloved hand, while Lily laughed openly, mocking the simple handyman who had supposedly come to rescue his wife from her own lies. But Jasper did not look like a simple laborer as he stood before the wealthy crowd, his white hair catching the afternoon light, and his pale gray eyes flashing with a sudden intense authority. His voice carried effortlessly across the entire garden, striking and clear as he began to challenge every single accusation Lily had made. He referenced specific estate deeds, private financial ledgers, and town business agreements with a level of intimate knowledge that no common handyman could ever possess. The wealthy merchants in the crowd exchanged confused, frightened looks, while the estate manager immediately took off his hat and lowered his head in absolute deference. Grace felt a sudden wave of intense dizziness wash over her as the pieces of the puzzle finally connected in her mind, forcing her to realize who her husband truly was. She remembered the magistrate bowing on the road, the merchant agreeing to the timber terms, and the deep respect the household staff had shown her from her very first day. The sudden realization that Jasper was the wealthy owner of the entire property made the sounds of the garden fade into a distant, confusing hum. Her vision blurred around the edges, the faces of her sister and Victoria twisting into strange shapes, before her knees completely gave way beneath her gray dress. Jasper moved with a speed that seemed entirely unnatural, catching her frame before she could touch the grass, and everything went completely dark as he lifted her into his arms. When Grace finally opened her eyes, she was lying on a large canopy bed inside the master bedroom of the grand estate, the dark wooden walls illuminated by the soft light of a desk lamp. A local physician was standing near the foot of the bed, while Jasper sat quietly on a wooden chair right beside her pillow, his pale face filled with an intense anxiety. Martha and Arthur were waiting near the heavy glass windows, their faces softening with immediate relief the moment they saw her stir against the white linens. The physician smiled warmly, stepping forward to check her pulse, and told her that she had given the entire household quite a significant fright by fainting in the garden. Grace tried to sit up against the pillows, asking what had caused her body to fail so suddenly after the confrontation with her sister. The doctor exchanged a quick, knowing look with Jasper before his smile widened and he offered his sincere congratulations to the young woman on her upcoming motherhood. He stated clearly that she was expecting a child, a revelation that caused the entire room to fall into a deep emotional silence for several long seconds. Grace stared at the doctor, her hand moving instinctively to rest against her flat stomach, as the reality of the words settled into her heart. Martha began to weep softly into her apron, while Arthur placed a proud hand on Jasper's shoulder, his eyes shining with a pure happiness they had not seen in years. The discovery brought an immediate wave of joy through the grand house, with the kitchen maids and footmen whispering the happy news through the corridors within the hour. But as the evening darkness settled completely over the estate, a heavy reality took hold of Jasper as he sat alone with his wife in the private sitting room. He realized that he was about to become a father, and the woman he loved with all his heart was carrying his child, while still believing he had deceived her out of malice. The weight of his hidden identity became completely unbearable, forcing him to look at Grace and admit the full truth of his ancient heritage and his family's position. He explained that the handyman persona was a simple mask he used to walk among the townspeople without the burden of his immense wealth and the hidden nature of his pale, night-dwelling family. He was not a poor laborer. He was the king of this hidden realm, a man who held absolute power over the entire territory and the lives of the people within it. When he finished speaking, the large sitting room fell into a cold silence that felt heavier than any argument they had ever shared since leaving the church. Grace stared at him, the tears finally spilling over her cheeks, as she processed the depth of the deception he had maintained for so many months. The pain did not come from the knowledge of his wealth or his unusual nature. It came from the realization that he had not trusted her enough to share his true self. She had willingly walked away from her own family and her social standing because she believed in the honesty of a simple man who had nothing to offer but his heart. Now, discovering that he had hidden his entire life from her felt like a deep betrayal of the trust she had fought so hard to build in the forest cottage. The 2 weeks following Jasper's confession were the most difficult days Grace had experienced since walking out on her father's household. Jasper gave her all the physical space she required, sleeping in a separate wing of the grand manor, and only appearing when she asked to speak with him about the household accounts. He answered every single one of her questions with total honesty, hiding nothing about his family's immense fortune or the influence they held over the state. He apologized repeatedly for his cowardice, admitting that his fear of losing her simple, unforced affection had blinded him to the hurt his silence would eventually cause. Grace struggled with her emotions, her mind constantly replaying their early days in the cottage, wondering if any of the quiet moments they shared had been real, or if it was all a staged play. While she was navigating the quiet rooms of the manor, events in the town center of Oak Ridge were beginning to unfold with remarkable destructive speed for her family. A massive public scandal erupted during a Friday night ballroom dance attended by all the prominent families who had once celebrated Lily's wealthy marriage. A young woman from a neighboring valley arrived at the hall completely uninvited, carrying a bundle of private letters and receipts that documented a long affair with Lily's husband, Charles. When Charles saw the woman, the color completely drained from his face, and the entire ballroom fell into a dead silence as the woman revealed the truth of his behavior. The final blow came when the stranger announced that she was carrying his child, an announcement that completely shattered Lily's carefully constructed illusion of a perfect, high-society life. The women who had once envied Lily's fine blue dresses now looked at her with open pity and whispered about her misfortune behind their laced fans as she fled the room in tears. The families who had spent months seeking her company suddenly found reasons to avoid her house, leaving her to sit alone in her large brick home with the consequences of her choices. At the exact same time, an internal investigation into the estate's management revealed the full extent of Victoria's dishonest behavior and her attempts to ruin Grace's reputation. Several former maids and footmen came forward to describe how Victoria had forced them to alter the supply logs and spread the false rumors among the townspeople. The evidence was completely undeniable, causing the prominent families of Oakridge to immediately distance themselves from Victoria, canceling her invitations and ending her social standing almost overnight. News of both disasters eventually reached the ears of Thomas and Eleanor inside their quiet home, forcing them to listen to the town gossip in total disbelief. Eleanor sat by her cold hearth, realizing that the wealthy marriage she had fought so hard to secure for Lily had become a source of permanent public shame for her name. The daughter she had favored above all others was now the object of universal sympathy, while the daughter she had dismissed as worthless was living in the grandest manor in the state. For the first time in his life, Duke Ambrose was forced to confront the true consequences of his years of silence and his failure to protect his eldest daughter from Eleanor's malice. When Eleanor attempted to blame Grace for their current misfortunes, Thomas finally found his voice shouting at his wife to be silent and openly defending his eldest child for the first time in 12 years. The final gathering at the Grand Estate was larger than any event the town of Oakridge had ever witnessed in its entire history. Polished carriages lined the long gravel entrance road for nearly half a mile, and the great ballroom glittered under the light of hundreds of white candles hanging from the ceiling. Hundreds of guests had arrived from across the region, all eager to catch a glimpse of the white-haired king and the quiet woman who had captured his heart. Grace entered the grand hall beside Jasper, her steps steady as she walked into the crowded room without a single trace of her old nervousness or fear. The people who had once mocked her plain gray dress now bowed their heads deeply as she passed, their faces filled with a sudden intense admiration that felt entirely unearned. Jasper led her to the center of the ballroom floor, raising his hand to bring a complete silence over the crowded room of wealthy merchants and local officials. He looked out at the guests, stating clearly that many of them remembered the day his wife left the town church beside a man they believed was a humble laborer. He reminded them that they had judged her character based entirely on what they believed he lacked, yet she had chosen him when she thought he had nothing to offer but honesty. Jasper turned to look directly into Grace's eyes, publicly apologizing for the fear that had guided his decisions and the silence that had caused her pain during their months together. The raw sincerity in his smooth voice silenced the remaining whispers in the room, forcing everyone to recognize the true depth of the love that held them together. Before Grace could reply, Eleanor and Lily approached their table from the edge of the crowd, their old confidence completely gone as they stood before the master of the estate. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she attempted to offer a clumsy, awkward apology for the hardships they had inflicted upon her during her years in their home. Lily stood beside her mother, her eyes fixed on the floor, as she mumbled her own regrets, her proud spirit entirely broken by the recent public scandals surrounding her husband. Grace listened to their words in silence, realizing that the moment she had spent years wishing for no longer held any power over her heart. She spoke to them calmly, without any trace of anger or a desire for revenge, simply stating that she no longer required their approval because she had finally found her own worth. Later that evening, Grace stood by a tall glass window overlooking the dark forest gardens, watching the pale moonlight rest against the white lilies below. Her father Thomas stepped up to stand beside her, his aged face lined with a deep, genuine remorse as he looked at the daughter he had failed to protect for so long. He admitted his complete failure as a parent, stating that his desire for a quiet life had made him a coward when he should have been her strongest shield against Eleanor's cruelty. Grace looked at his tired eyes and saw the sincere regret within them, realizing that while the past could never be erased, a small bridge for the future could finally begin to form. As Jasper walked back to her side and took her cool hand in his, she looked out at the dark trees, ready to leave the shadows of her childhood behind forever. The cold winter air of the Vermont woods always seemed to soften when it reached the stone walls of our home, as if the forest itself recognized the peace we had built within these rooms. Sitting by the high glass windows of the nursery, I watched the pale morning light touch the white blankets, where our young son lay sleeping, his breath small and steady in the quiet room. For so many years of my life, I believed that happiness was a distant prize that belonged only to people like Lily, people who wore bright silk dresses and never had to clear the soot from their own fingers. I spent my youth waiting for a single word of kindness from a father who could not find the courage to look at me, believing that my own worth was measured by the coldness of the people who shared my name. It is a strange thing to realize how much time we waste trying to fit into spaces that were never truly designed to hold our hearts, changing our own steps just to please those who will never choose to see us. Jasper entered the room without a sound, his white hair catching the silver tint of the winter sun, as he leaned down to adjust the small woolen blanket around our child's shoulders. He looked up at me with those steady, pale gray eyes that had once offered me a lifeline in a crowded church, his cool hand finding mine and closing around my fingers with a familiar, reassuring strength. The deception that had once caused me such sharp pain had dissolved into the deeper understanding of why he had worn that simple gray coat, a mask born out of his own desire to be loved for the simple truth of his character rather than the immense power of his crown. We had both been hiding from a world that measured value by appearances, finding each other in the exact moment when we were ready to walk away from the expectations of high society. Looking out at the long gravel paths and the quiet rows of pine trees stretching into the northern horizon, I knew that the future ahead of us would not be defined by the old cruelties or the shadows of Oak Ridge. Our son would grow up in a house where his voice would always be heard, surrounded by a love that did not require a mask or a promise made in convenience. The balance of our lives had finally shifted into something real, a quiet belonging that belonged entirely to us, built from the honest choices of a handyman and a girl who finally learned her own worth.